Welcome to the Depth Mystic Community Podcast, episode 14, where I, Zach Tolan, am both the host and the guest. I went out into the world and I looked for a podcast that was by a Jungian depth mystic. And then I realized nobody had even invented the term Jungian depth mystic. There is only one other person who I can say qualifies as a fully trained depth mystic. His name is Peter Kingsley, and he is a hardcore mystic. But there's no one making internet media. And so I started the Depth Mystic Community Podcast. This is a monologic communologue. As the host, I'm the one trying to make the show reasonably entertaining for the common student of depth psychology. I'm the diplomat, the person presenting it to the public. But I'd like to introduce you to my guest, Jungian depth mystic Zach Tolan, who likes to stay away from the crowd. His mystical experience is so profound and intense that, like a religious prophet, he retreats to a cave and has to be sought out. Now, he claims to have had a mystical experience that lasted 21 years, starting in 1997 and going through 2018. And it took this long for him to download the mystery information from the divine source. But at the end of it, we can call him a fully trained depth mystic. A phenomenon so rare that basically nobody knows what it is. And yet we also consider it of the utmost importance as students of depth mysticism ourselves. But please welcome Zach Tolan. Hello. Okay, here's a question for you. As the host of this podcast, I am presenting what we could call a Yang personality. Whereas, as the reclusive mystic who has to be sought out, you are presenting a Yin personality. Can you explain a little bit about these two concepts? Well, yeah. So the host is outward facing, and Yang is the external world. It's associated with masculinity. And you think of a man going out and hunting or bringing home the bacon. A man going out into the external world and doing what needs to be done in order to secure the safety and abundance of the internal world. Whereas the yin would be the feminine component, which is the development of the internal world, the creating of an internal world worth providing for. Now, yin by its very nature is harder to pin down. It's the kind of ever-present discovery of reality. And it doesn't lock itself down into a decision about how things ought to be. It's constantly capable of changing its mind. Are you saying that as host of the show, because I have to constantly think about how the audience is going to respond, because I'm putting on a presentation and I'm figuring out how to manage the audience, that I'm embodying a Yang persona. Well, basically, yeah, because you're not preoccupied with authentic being. You're not preoccupied with the mere observation of reality. Your job is to decide what the audience will experience, rather than constantly manifest reality no matter what it is. But as a mystic, I can afford to pay constant attention to reality, regardless of whether it's going to be popular or not. Well, that's pretty fascinating. And I can see why we might need both roles. Because regular listeners aren't necessarily here because they're mystics who already know everything about reality. They could be here for all sorts of reasons. So, from the perspective of a show, you need a host who is going to be able to translate for whoever happens to be listening. So, am I totally Yang? And are you totally Yin? No, not necessarily. One thing about these concepts is that insofar as you're going to be loyal to the idea of Yin, then you're loyal to the idea of not nailing it down completely, not knowing exactly everything that's going on. The Tao symbol has both a Yang and a Yin intertwined with each other. And it emphasizes both equally. Insofar as we're going to respect the nature of the Yin principle, we aren't going to pretend to have every aspect of it understood. As I said, Yin is constantly trying to pay attention to reality, whereas Yang is much more interested in locking down an idea. But Yin has to remain open. If we take it to its farthest extent, we'll never truly know what Yin and Yang are. So not even in principle would I allow us to reassure ourselves with such certainty, because that would be a very Yang position to take. When it comes to trying to illustrate these two principles, I'm far from being willing to take a fully Yang position myself on what exactly they are. But of course, if as a host I am primarily Yang, then it is of interest to me to lock down something, to get some kind of clarity as to what kind of statement I'm actually going to be making for the audience. Because Yang is appreciated by people who don't know anything. You just give them something to latch onto, some little nugget of certainty. If I can provide the people, it's obviously of interest to me to be able to do that. Well, yes, naturally. I mean, in your position, that makes perfect sense. As host, I'm kind of enjoying this little interview. Well, that makes sense, because we've been looking for an approach that respects both the depths and the performance. With this little formula that we've arrived at, where you're the host and I'm the guest, we may have actually finally solved the big issue of how the show can be loyal both to the inner and the outer world. So there's reason to be happy about the interview. But the bigger thing might be that we've actually found a solution to the problem of the basic construct of this podcast going forward. We've needed a solution, and we've been working hard towards finding one. And if we didn't find one, we'd be damned to hell for all eternity. So it's inevitable that we struggle and hopefully finally find a really good approach. As mystic, I'm laughing because it's so simple once you stumble on the formula. As host, I would say we definitely needed a formula. And now I can sort of ask you any question I want. As mystic, and it's kind of fun to recognize the convergence of the two roles of guest and spiritual teacher. I mean, that alleviates all the responsibility from me of having to manage a performance, to put together a show with conscientiousness towards some kind of general audience, which is almost impossible to conceive of. And as a mystic, it's much more fun to be a guest and have the host manage that whole thought process. It's exciting to finally realize that simple equation. And now as host, I feel a certain kind of liberation. For the sake of a good show, it's my job to just come up with questions to get the answer from somebody who knows more than we do, or at least who's good at playing the part of somebody who knows more than we do. You're the guest. I'm the host. It's a surprise conjunction of two different social constructions. A conjunction, you say? We love that word, conjunction. Carl Jung's final and biggest work on alchemy. It's called The Mystery of the Conjunction. When I notice a conjunction here with the teacher-student role and then the podcast host-guest role, it's hard for me not to think of what Carl Jung thought of as the culminating idea of his entire project of studying historical alchemy, which is the mystery of the conjunction. As host, I had wanted to set the dialogue up as spiritual teacher talking to student. But only today did I realize, finally, that the host is actually the student. He's the one who asks the teacher questions. But he's also the manager of the podcast, the one trying to make sure that the people listening are experiencing something stimulating enough to not be boring and coherent enough to not be confusing. And it's the host's job. It's also the student's job. But as host, I do have to stop and ask, is this one little thought enough to make a whole episode? Or do I need to ask you some more questions? Let's make it a little longer. Part 2. Hi. Let's start from the beginning. Now, nobody knows what a depth mystic is at this stage in civilization. But it's a term that depth mystic Zach Tolan came up with to describe himself. Rather than letting me explain it, I can just ask the depth mystic himself. So, what is a depth mystic, and why did you come up with the term? Well, hi. Thank you for having me on your podcast. It's nice to be interviewed by somebody who knows about my existence. So the term depth mystic, if we understand the original field from which this term came to be the field of depth psychology, then we are removing the term psychology and substituting the term mystic. And why is that? And the answer, at least in my case, is I ended up being sent straight into what they call the unconscious at such an early age that I was unable to equip myself with the career apparatus that they normally expect in depth psychology. Traditionally, depth psychology is thought to be for people who are having a midlife crisis. And it is thought to serve the needs of the second half of life. But I was sent into this realm, and I didn't already have the life experience and career background that most people who end up in depth psychology already have. For whatever reason, I was called upon by God or the unconscious or the higher power to undertake a hero's quest at an extremely young age. And the validity of this quest was solidified for me by a mystical experience. The term depth psychology gets its legitimacy from the existing field of psychology, which many people already give credence to and validity to. The depth is a much more mysterious and more difficult to validate within society aspect of the psychology. But the psychology is where Carl Jung originally found the grounding connection to society. He became a psychiatrist, then called his philosophy his psychology. And so while society gives a lot of credence to the study of psychology, it is respected in almost all areas of society. The depth aspect is in a much smaller part of society. People who care about the depths don't have the same institutional support. Now, if you go all the way and you take somebody like me, who went entirely into the depths, that is studied by depth psychology, without any societal backing, I can't even really call myself a psychologist, because psychologists usually have some kind of counseling degree or some kind of training with psychology programs. But if I'm completely self-taught, then maybe we need a new word for what I am. I don't consider myself the only depth mystic, however. There's a man named Peter Kingsley, and I consider him the only other living, fully trained depth mystic. Now, there are also people in the realm of depth psychology, trained Jungian analysts. One person I consider a depth mystic who died is named Robert A. Johnson. And of all people, I consider myself more like Robert A. Johnson in terms of my life story than any other person I've found. And both of these examples, Peter Kingsley and Robert A. Johnson, actively considered themselves mystics. So I do think it's actually a real category that I'm referring to. And it does properly distinguish me from depth psychologists. Now, for people who have no knowledge of depth psychology, I mean, that's to be expected in a lot of ways, because by definition, it's deep. And so a lot of people aren't going to be willing or able to go into those depths. So your journey began when you watched a recording Joseph Campbell and the power of myth. Maybe you can tell us about that. Yeah, so for me, Joseph Campbell is the big deal. He is my connection to society. I think my temperament is very similar to his. And I was utterly lost when I was 19 years old. I had no idea where life was supposed to go. And then, like the mentor in the hero's darkest moment, helping the hero to understand the big picture. Like Obi-Wan Kenobi saving Luke Skywalker and teaching him about the Force. Joseph Campbell, he appears and explains how little the average person is willing to understand reality. That most people are caught up in myths. Very few people are mythologically educated. And he actually has studied all the myths. And so he's basically a fully trained Jedi Knight. And it opened up a whole new world. It feels like there is something like a conspiracy in society to defeat the mystical, artistic personality. We don't immediately recognize the type of person who can become a mystic or a philosopher or an artist. And we don't have avenues for them once they appear. And just like in Star Wars, now the Jedi are all but extinct. It seems to apply. Like the kind of wisdom figure that Joseph Campbell represented and that I instantly wanted to become upon discovering him, you get the feeling that they're not recognized nowadays. It's one of the most abstract types of professions or careers to become a mystic, to experience something ineffable that you can't describe in ordinary terms, and to make that the central piece of what you think your life should be about. Joseph Campbell was able to accomplish it, and he showed me that it was possible. And maybe there is no conspiracy in society. Maybe there's just so few people like me who are born with the desire to become a Jedi, who are fully trained in the mystical arts. But of course, why would Star Wars be so popular if people didn't have some intuition about it? It's just what Joseph Campbell represented was the real-world concretization of the Jedi mythology presented in Star Wars. He was the Obi-Wan Kenobi to my Luke Skywalker. So, what realm of philosophy and mysticism is that? We could call it depth mysticism, but that's a term that was only applied decades later. But to people who are just in regular society, what kind of knowledge did you become obsessed with? Well, you could say it's in the realm of religion and philosophy. Although it's not in the realm of religion, which is oriented towards obedience, towards discovering the sacred rules and then just following the rules. That's not the realm of religion that this kind of mysticism operates in. Because a lot of the knowledge that really matters, I suppose it only applies at a kind of high level of consciousness. And if you don't fully understand the lower levels of consciousness that serve as its foundation, then you will inevitably misapply the strategies and the techniques. The wisdom will be of little value because you won't be able to apply it right. You'll be like the cargo cult people of, I think it's New Zealand, where they saw a plane land, they saw a Western airplane land, and then they patched together a bunch of their own materials in the shape of an airplane, thinking that they could make it fly. So a lot of this Jedi wisdom, it requires like a baseline level of consciousness in order to be used effectively. So how would you describe it? Like, how would you describe this esoteric wisdom that you became so interested in? Well, one answer is that I would describe it as a full consciousness of the way in which the assumptions of society contrast with actual reality. There's a lot of people who just are sort of blindly obedient or just completely unawake to the forces that control them and that are accepted by society. I mean, there are forces that are not accepted by society. There are behaviors that will cause you to be considered a criminal and locked up. And society recognizes those behaviors and rejects them. But there are other behaviors that are in violation of actual reality, but that are not recognized by society as bad. And so it's in that place that I think the Jedi, or what I would call the depth mystic, learns his wisdom. Okay, that's pretty interesting. You're talking about society as if it has a form and it has edges. And anything within that form is kind of allowable, but the closer you get to the edge of that society, it's not allowed. As mystic, oh yes, and I should add, like, that there are plenty of behaviors that are perfectly acceptable and good in reality, but that are disapproved of by society. That's a missing piece I didn't think of, but I should have. So the Jedi knowledge is all the things that are accepted by society, but that are actually bad or evil in reality, and all the things that are rejected by society, but are actually good in reality. Right, and you're talking as if society and reality are these distinct entities. They can just be observed. Do you think they can be observed by anybody? As mystic, I would say no. Both ability and willingness are the restricting factors. And there are many people who I don't think have the requisite intelligence to observe what I call reality. They are too easily hypnotized and distracted by the many things of society. Society is constantly putting forth various stimuli that one has to be able to see through or to contextualize, to understand that, oh, these are stimuli that are being put forth in this society and are typically going to cause this emotional or cognitive reaction in me, but that's all they are. They are not reality. For most people, they see the stimuli put forth in society and they think that that is reality. They may never even detect the actual reality that resides outside of what society finds acceptable. So no, I don't. And originally I did. Like when I first had my mystic vision at the age of 20, I felt like everybody had to go through what I went through. I had had a rebirth experience. And I thought that that's what everybody has to have. I thought it was just like the one true religious formula that I had discovered and that I needed everybody else to experience exactly the same way. And it took me a while and a lot of people watching to realize that a very large percentage of people are at lower levels of consciousness and are unlikely to benefit by having this kind of awakening that I had, because it would only confuse them. So as a host of a Depth Mystic podcast, if you're saying this kind of knowledge is very elite, that puts a wrinkle in my desire to be like a generally successful podcast. Because a podcast, one of the goals is to get as many downloads as possible, to have as many people listen to it as possible. But if like one of the basic premises about the knowledge you're talking about is that only a small percentage of people are in a position to benefit from it, well, then you would be implying that this podcast would have to be naturally targeting a kind of elite audience, which makes me kind of uncomfortable. I mean, as a podcast host in a so-called democracy, people are kind of expecting everyone to get a vote, which means they're kind of expecting every product that is made by people in a democracy hoping to succeed will somehow appeal to everybody, kind of like a political party is trying to win elections. It poses a considerable conundrum. As mystic, I would say the basic attitude you should have as a podcast host is you are broadcasting at a certain frequency that only some people can hear. And your primary goal is to broadcast as clearly and as loudly in that frequency as you can. So yeah, I think it's inevitable. You have to target your ideal audience. So the question is, as a byproduct of you targeting your ideal audience, what are your chances of, firstly, not making the people who are not the ideal audience who happen to listen to it angry at you? How do you, firstly, not incur their wrath, and secondly, possibly appeal to them in some ancillary way that nonetheless is helpful insofar as other people like to listen to it for their own personal reasons that might not qualify as interesting from a depth mystic point of view, but are nonetheless their own reasons? So as host, I'm thinking, in any podcast, any kind of democratic form of media where it's not secretly passed around amongst a pre-selected group of initiated people, and it's made so that anybody can listen to it, there has to be this conscientiousness of a split between the target audience. Let's say that's 10% of people, just for the sake of illustration. And then there's the 90% of people who might listen to it by chance. And you have to do two things. One is not make them angry. And the other is possibly, if you can get a free benefit, make your podcast in such a way that they're attracted to it for reasons that you don't care about, but nonetheless help the podcast. And this is interesting because it would actually be true for anybody making a podcast for a target audience. And as mystic, I would say that reminds me of Alexis de Tocqueville's analysis of America, where he says, because it's ruled by the middle class and there is no elite ruling class, it doesn't have the disadvantages of the kind of cruelty that the elite class is capable of putting onto the poor people. But it doesn't have the advantages of the elite class being comfortable with itself and being able to do what it needs to do without having to worry about the opinions of the mob. Maybe his final verdict was that it might actually be better to have an elite class that just does what it needs to do without asking the mob. But in America, traditionally, we've had this thing where you have to compulsively care about the average person. You have to compulsively care about the common man. But as I said, the podcast doesn't really serve a purpose unless you are broadcasting in your particular frequency that only certain people can hear in the loudest and clearest possible way, because those are the actual audience who are going to care about what you're doing. Like, you're talking about a community, a depth mystic community. Those are your actual community. Those are the people who are actually your community. But of course, it's a public medium, and you need the non-target audience to at least not hate your podcast. Well, thank you, Depth Mystic Zach Tolan. That's a valuable thought. And it's interesting that it's sort of true for every podcast with an elite target audience of some kind. And yet, we seem to have needed to articulate it explicitly. Yes, and the reason for that is because we are sort of threading a needle between being elite secret knowledge and being publicly liked. But we also want to live in reality. There's some call to authenticity. We want to tell the truth. I guess I've always wanted to be totally honest with people. But the problem is, as host, when you have a situation like this where you actually believe the knowledge is elite, like, it can't be understood and valued and used well by people who don't already have a certain level of consciousness to begin with, then you're in kind of an American conundrum. You know, the spirit of America has always made it much harder for people in that situation who really do have some kind of elite sensibility. And yet Americans, they are self-empowered. Like, the average person feels much more empowered than the average person has historically under most aristocratic societies. So our relationship to the mass man is one where we're trained to compulsively try to appeal to the mass man. At some point, your work has to serve as its own filter for the audience. Those members of the audience that want and need what you're doing will be drawn to it, and those that can't use what you're doing will move away all by themselves. Okay, well, thank you, Jungian Depth Mystic Zach Tolan. I think that'll do it for this episode. I feel like we've expressed ourselves. We've covered a topic sufficiently satisfactorily.